Do we have a beautiful community there? I think we do. So let's have a chat about some of the dire warnings we've heard, in particular the one from Mr. Khodorkovsky about how the West and Ukraine might be losing to the tyrant in the Kremlin. And let's see what we think about these warnings and make a few thoughtful remarks in and around the kind of conversation that implicates us in. I normally, because of my health, only do two things a day. No, one thing a day at the moment. And even though a medical procedure of mine that I was looking forward to was cancelled today, I did some other medical testing, and that means that I may not be at my best in this conversation. So make a note to yourself that this is going to be a chat with the smallest possible C, a sort of brain dead late evening cup of tea kind of chat. So let's do it. A few of you have asked me to comment on what Mr. Khodorkovsky has said, and what he's roughly said is that, and I have it here somewhere, hang on, there we go. We are practically losing the war in Ukraine, and at the current rate, and he arrives at this sentence, at the current rate, what will happen after a series of factual remarks, which I won't reproduce, because if I reproduce them, I'll need to assess them, and I want to withhold from assessing them. But he talks about how much Putin spends on the war, how much help Ukraine gets, how Putin is outproducing Ukraine plus the Western help it gets, the discrepancy in population size between Russia and Ukraine. And he concludes that the way we're going, we could lose Kharkiv in a year and Odessa the following year, and that by 2026 things will be really, really dire if we carry on going the way we're going. So his message is that Western support is woefully inadequate relative to not just Ukraine's needs, but relative to the West's strategic needs, and indeed relative to the needs of Russian citizens as he interprets them. Now, we don't need to say anything about Mr. Khodorkovsky's views or his biography to recognize that he does feel a deep sense of responsibility for the war. And one of the first things he said to Ukrainians when the war started was, "Please forgive me." He wasn't admitting guilt by saying that. He was just expressing a sense of responsibility by association. And this is, again, a distinction that we made about a year or so ago on the main channel in the video that differentiated guilt by association, which is something we do not believe in, and responsibility by association, something that we absolutely do believe in. If my sister robs a bank, I'm not guilty of anything, but just in virtue of my association with her, even though I knew nothing about it, I am a bit ethically implicated. So what's going on? Why is this statement so alarmist? Does it need to be this alarmist? Well, it's activism and political mobilization aimed to achieve transformation through alarming people. That's one way to intervene constructively, sometimes, but other times not, in the informational environment. So Mr. Khodorkovsky is not acting here as an analyst. Western military analysts at the moment, insofar as they converge, it seems to be they tend to think that this is a very precarious time for Ukraine, where Ukraine needs to hold on, minimize advantages that Russia can acquire over the coming months, and do plenty of firefighting. They recognize that Ukraine has a manpower crisis that it is doing something to try to resolve, and we need to see what the results will be. And they recognize that Ukraine has a huge weaponry and ammunition shortage crisis too. But they don't anticipate any imminent gains for the Russians except just tactical gains. And they anticipate by 2025 Russia running into trouble that it's not facing now, for example, around a crisis of shortage of equipment. So there is certainly a distance between the mainstream military analysis and what Mr. Khodorkovsky is articulating. Nevertheless, it's very important to be honest about trends, whether they're positive or negative. Very important to be honest about the West's relative lack of strategy. And it's very important to be honest about the uncertainty of war. And it's wonderful to see military experts like Mike Kaufman, for example, who are so wonderful at this sort of ethical virtue of emphasizing the uncertainty that underlies what they say, even though they know so much. My own feeling is that we have a double delusion. One is more understandable and the other is less understandable. The more understandable delusion is the delusion of Western powers that you can tackle the Putin threat piecemeal by doing something here, doing something there, and then waiting and seeing, and then reacting, and then doing something there and doing something here again. It's a sort of a piecemeal wait and see strategy, non-strategy. But there is a second, less understandable delusion among critics of that absence of strategy. So these are people who are, like almost all of you, supporters in the West of supporting Ukraine, who are critical of the lack of strategy, but are neutral or agnostic about what might be the case 6 months from now. That's to say, we could have a strategy in 6 months. And that itself is a profound illusion. Because our lack of strategy is a byproduct of our democratic incapacity. However, the good news is that our democratic incapacity, about which I've spoken extensively in other videos on the main channel and here, isn't just a sort of filled out block. It's rather a situation whereby 70 or 80% of the block is decided against us. We are rather helpless and immobile, but there is a 20 to 30% space to act and to gain more of a strategy than we currently have, and that's entirely, pushing for that is entirely reasonable and entirely realistic. The illusion of this agnostic or neutral kind, that we don't have a strategy now, but you never know, it could reappear. And so there is these endless articles about how we need a strategy and how it's really time we developed it by experts that are largely predicated on the mistaken assumption that the failure we're dealing with is a failure of willpower, which it overwhelmingly isn't a failure of willpower by major Western powers. But there is this 20-30% space that we can exploit to develop more of a strategy than we currently have. Now, if you ask the Biden administration, they would say, well, look, actually, we're doing well in many respects. We've achieved a lot in this conflict. Ukraine stands and looks like it'll stand. The Putin regime has been humiliated at several points. NATO has been rejuvenated to some extent. The Europeans have been woken up a bit to their own security needs and woken up a bit to the need to engage with the United States around the Chinese threat. So these are all victories. So come on, get off our back. And look at the domestic challenges we're facing. To have been able to do that is already to have done a lot. Now, I don't personally believe that that is enough to guarantee that Mr. Putin doesn't deliver some kind of a strategic defeat for the West. However, there is another way forward for us, even if we don't use that 20 and 30% space to develop a richer strategy. And that space is just lucking out through events, dear boy. There's plenty that can happen. And it might be that it's events that prevent Mr. Putin from challenging NATO, challenging Article 5, or meeting his aspirations in Ukraine, which remain basically political control over Ukraine. Doesn't necessarily have to be territorial control, but it's political control over Ukraine in my analysis. And then some further infliction of a strategic defeat on the West in Putin's sense. So we could just luck out, even if we don't strategically improve. But I think that us lucking out may be a pretty grim picture for Ukraine. So let's talk a tiny bit about mobilization, really from a public intellectual point of view. We haven't spoken about military mobilization in Ukraine, and obviously that's intentional, because while I'm more able to speak to it than most people who speak about it, it's unethical for me to speak about it, because I don't have sufficient insights. There are all kinds of aspects of that issue that I can't comment on. I can't comment on the degree to which Ukrainian military is still a Soviet military with Soviet-type leadership across many, many positions in a way that is very unlovely and off-putting to people. I can't comment on that cycle of lack of manpower disincentivizing others from joining and volunteering, because it's really terrifying. I can comment a bit more, but on balance I still won't, on this sense many Ukrainians have that many of the elites and just many of the least disadvantaged people are able to bypass this net of military mobilization, which is also what's happening on a greater level in Russia too. So this sense of inequality and resentment and injustice. And that there's all kinds of issues around lack of proper training, and so all of that I put aside. There's only a couple of things I want to comment on. One, a really big historical thing that really isn't to do with Ukraine specifically, but it's to do with any country trying to mobilize. And the second is a political discourse thing, and it's a minor remark that I will start with now. And that is that the communication of Zelensky regime, Zelensky administration has not been good around mobilization. So we've been too much in the realm of discourse of compulsion rather than discourse of explanation, clarity of vision, sense of mission. And it's sort of hard to put these pieces together for you guys, because you might have the impression Zelensky is an amazing communicator, and he is, and he isn't. It just depends on the mode of communication that's required from him. So for instance, in February 2022, if I were a Ukrainian citizen, I would have been really uncomfortable with the fact that there was this armada gathered on my border by this neighbor who seems to be suffering from imperialist mania, and these tens of thousands of troops are there. And what's my government telling me? about what I should think, what I should feel, what I should do, how I should prepare, what I should expect. Not much. I'm left in a communicative vacuum. So that context is important. But let me now say something very general about mobilization, because what all these things we've listed are really various kinds of either political flaw or political failure. Political flaw as in things that the Ukrainian government just couldn't have fixed under conditions of war, and then political failures, things they could have done much better. But what's very significant is that none of this is the fault of Ukrainian people. And if anything, the Ukrainian people probably may well have done better than we would have done under equivalent circumstances. And that's because it's really hard to mobilize people in the 21st century. So let's take a step back and say a few words about that. For those of you who listen to classical music, and you don't need to know anything about classical music to get this point, it's really a point about how your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents came to feel more like individuals. In Bach, everything is part of the fabric of the universe. You can't detach yourself as an individual from that flow. You're just an element in it. In Mozart, and now we're moving to the late 1700s, you absolutely can. But you're powerless against that flow. It just takes you, right? So tragic resignation is the mode of many of Mozart's great minor key compositions. As we move into Beethoven a few years later, we go a step further. We don't just differentiate ourselves from the flow, but we can then rebel and resist against the flow. And that resistance in Beethoven is futile. You're going to lose, but you are doing a revolt, a futile revolt against fate. And there ain't no revolt in Mozart. There's just this inexorable sweeping away of you. And as we move beyond Beethoven, you can actually have revolt against that flow that succeeds. So what am I describing? I'm describing the formation in European culture of a certain conception of the individual. And as we get into the 20th century, and then now into the 21st, we are dealing with very fragmented conceptions of the individual. That's to say, we're really dealing with people who can't integrate their work ethics with their private life ethics properly. You know, at work, you're doing something that harms the environment. In your private life, you do things to protect the environment. Well, what holds both of these senses of responsibility together? What integrates ethically these two identities? Well, sometimes it feels like it's nothing and they just don't speak to each other. So there is extraordinary fragmentation that we are stuck with, for better or worse, in a modern disenchanted world. And it's hard to mobilize folks like that. Indeed, folks like that may not even feel a strong affiliation with their country, or may feel they belong to 2 or 3 countries at the same time. So, you know, mobilizing Brits in 2024 is not like mobilizing Brits in 1914. And to get that difference about all the ways in which it's about me that we're stuck with, that aren't quite there 100 years ago. Just listen to the way the Morse code messages on the Titanic are exchanged. And there's videos of that on YouTube that produce all of these messages consecutively. And They're some of the most moving videos on the internet, because there is a kind of self-abnegation and dignity there that is inaccessible to us. And it's not because we're failures, it's because we're in a different cultural moment. So it's bloody hard. Mobilizing is really, really hard. What I would say then politically is that Ukraine is still facing this challenge of how to approach, execute, negotiate a reset from a short, victorious war backed by Western support to a war with precarious backing that is a long resource war with uncertain outcome and an absence of a likely prospect of regaining all of one's territories. And the Putin regime has actually successfully reset itself to relate to this war exactly for the kind of war that it is. And it started that with the so-called partial mobilization in 2022. The best outcome for the West can materialize in two ways. Either we develop more of a strategy and use that 20-30%, if you like, democratic capacity for strategy generation, right? That is to a degree of 70-80% just obstructed. And it's very important that to use that properly, we have to acknowledge that the rest is obstructed. So it's a form of illusion in politics to just immediately jump from the fact that something is right and highly desirable to the idea that it's possible. In fact, we will be able to exploit more of that 20 and 30% if we accept that that 70% can't be moved. And that way of dealing with the challenge obviously is going to meet not just our needs, but Ukraine's needs more. The other way of dealing with the challenge and getting away with it successfully is just allowing history to luck us through. And that means, events. Dear boy, interfering and preventing Putin from inflicting the strategic defeat he wants to inflict on us, and prevents him from realizing his goals in Ukraine too. Although if we are just relying on lucking out, we might probably just about get away with it, or it'll be a close, nearly 50-50 call. But the outcome for Ukraine will be fairly catastrophic. So that modest, humble understanding of our sort of room for strategic regeneration is what we need to work with. I'm not confident I've made sufficient sense in this chat with you, but I'm grateful for your time, and we'll speak very soon.